So Joey Jones is a retired Marine bomb technician, also a Fox News contributor. And Joey, good morning to you. I know you've been watching this from afar. I really just want to tap into your perspective on what we're learning from the family. He was hearing voices in his ear apparently over the past 6 months or a year. Apparently he had hearing aids attached to him as well. Made threats against people on his own base over the summer. Spent 2 weeks in a mental hospital. I don't know where he went after that, but it sure seems like the ball was dropped somewhere. Joey, how do you try and piece this together?
Yeah, this is a really tough situation, especially for people like his family who, from what I've read, tried their best to report local law enforcement and report to the Army, hey, this is happening, we need to get him help. Ultimately, it's most tough and tragic for the families of the people that were murdered by this man. Whatever his reasoning or whatever led him there, they're the victims, and obviously we care so much about them. Listen, I served in the military. I spoke to a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force who's with a reserve unit here locally yesterday. There isn't a pipeline of communication from a military unit to local law enforcement when it comes to mental health that's mandated or even common. That might be a problem, it may not. We have a balance here between your constitutional rights as an individual and what's best for the public interest. And as much as I love to advocate for the Second Amendment, I think that is the problem that actually needs to be addressed. Rather than how do we limit the rights of law-abiding, sane individuals, how do we pinpoint and acutely attack issues like this? Look at every mass shooter over the last several years. How many weren't suffering from mental health issues? Very, very few. And I think that commonality is really important.
Joey, this was planned so well. I want to talk about this guy's skill level. If we can pull up this full screen, showing his military record. He was Sergeant First Class, Petroleum Supply Specialist in the Army Reserve. Didn't have any combat deployments, but he received a couple of rewards for his service. You and I, Joey, have been talking about his skill set that he might be using to avert authorities. What does he know? What does he not know that could make this a tougher job for local law enforcement?
Yeah, I really want to push back on the public's perception that this is some Jason Bourne character who had, severe or extensive training in the military to avert police. There's nothing that's been told about him that proves that to be the case. I'm not saying it isn't the case. He could have gone to SEER school. He could have gone to any number of training schools that any soldier has the opportunity to go to if their unit will let him. But knowing what I know about him, he didn't have pre-deployment combat training. He didn't have any type of infantry training. He had very basic skills training to do the job he did. That's what I know for a fact. If he had anything beyond that, they're not saying. And the reason why I bring that up is he lives in Maine. Maine is a wilderness. It's a mostly untamed wilderness that's under snow for a couple of feet for months out of the year. The people up there hunt bear and moose, which are, almost predators. A bear is a predator. The lifestyle of an outdoorsman in Maine is probably more applicable to what this man can do to avert police than any of his Army training. And I'm not belittling or talking down what the Army trains or the Marine Corps or any other service trains, but this belief that because someone served in the military, they have a supernatural ability to avert police and go on the run just simply isn't true. You can learn more, quite frankly, on the internet or in a gun club when it comes to surviving in the wilderness and hunting and being stealthy than you can in basic training. And so I just want to calm people a little bit in thinking that anyone who served in the military might have gone to combat and have PTSD as this super soldier that can wreak havoc. That's simply not true, and it hasn't been proven true by any of the major incidents that's happened in this country. And I really want to make sure people understand that serving, especially as a reservist, you're a citizen soldier. You spend more time in society than you do on base, and you can learn just as much by being an outdoorsman when it comes to this type of situation, and I think that's important for people to understand.
Joey, we were in contact yesterday, and you were calling into question this whole title about a firearms specialist. That's what he was described to us. Can you explain to our audience what that might mean?
Yeah, a firearms instructor, I don't know if that's certified by an organization like the National Rifle Association, or if you took an online course and was a firearms instructor at a local gun range. You can go on YouTube and see video after video of a certified firearms instructor doing really dumb things. And I only bring that up because, again, I don't want an incident like this and these labels that are slapped so quickly to demonize or stoke fear among a whole community of people. Whether or not he is a well-trained marksman probably relies more on what he's done as a civilian on his own time than in the military, or even obtaining a very general certificate that says firearms instructor. What we're seeing right now is he went into a building full of very, very vulnerable targets and took advantage of that situation with a weapon. And that's something that you don't have to be any type of expert to do. We saw it over and over again. We've seen it. It's a problem. It needs to be fixed. I think places need to be fortified and people need to be vigilant, but we've seen very inexperienced people do similar things. So I just want people to understand what these terms mean, why they are or are not applicable. Right now, he's averting police in Maine. The chances are the fact that he spent so much time outdoors is why he's able to do that, not because of any extensive firearm training or time in the Army. And I think that's important because what we know is more than 100 million people own guns. There are more than 20 million ARs in this country. There are tens of millions of people that enjoy the outdoors. One person going absolutely crazy does not demonize those subsets of people or make those skill sets negative for our society.
Very, very fair and good point, Joey Jones. Thank you for joining us and giving us your insight. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Come back.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Joey.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.